If there's anything that Jesus addresses in the gospel today that could be an impediment for the salvation, not only of his contemporary, but even of our time, can be praised, can be summarized in one particular thought. We don't usually dance by the tune. Sabi ni Jesus sa gospel ngayon na nagpe-play ng flute but we did not dance. Nagpe-play, we sang a dirge like a funeral song but we did not weep. One of the great obstacles in man today is we wanted always to stand out, to be stubborn, not in parallel or in harmony with God's will. God is manifesting himself through the prophets, the highest of whom was John the Baptist, and now he came with his own son, and yet we wanted to insist upon our own ways rather than God's ways. And I think that's very fundamental in any kind of work and the economy of salvation, redemption, that we are saved and redeemed, not so much of our personal, stubborn creativity, but by conformity to the will of God. Could you imagine going to a party and they're actually playing, a fast song and you are dancing slowly? There's only one conclusion. Gurang ka na. So you're probably not dancing properly according to the tune. But the point here is that Jesus was saying that people are so wanted to be unique and individual to the point that they considered the conformity to God's will, conformity to God's plan as opposed to the real concept of happiness. John the Baptist was preaching penance and they would not listen to him. Jesus was preaching festivity because the groom was with them and will accuse him of gluttony and, of course, of being friends of tax collectors. So this is actually the tragedy of humanity today, the desire to be so unique to the point of being disharmonized with God's will. We always consider people who are obedient to the will of God, obedient to the church that teaches the will of God, to be an old-fashioned approach to happiness. We always emphasize this individuality or creativity or being unique, If you'll find that even in the liturgy today, they said you have to be very creative. I remember when I was in America, there was this clown mass that was actually being celebrated because it has to be unique for the children with defiance of the liturgical norms, saying it's so rigid and so, structured, as it were. Not knowing, of course, that in the Old Testament, even the very act of worship is defined by God, God told them what to do. It's a kind of a divine revelation of their own Jewish rubrics, you might say. So this is actually fundamental in our economy of salvation, that we are to conform to the will of God. Even sometimes, or probably most of the time, people will seem to oppose. People will actually judge us to be old-fashioned, I always hear that with myself. I'm an old-fashioned. And other people, of course, seems to be very, very creative in a lot of things. And that we see, of course, in the life of the martyrs we celebrate today. They, becoming Christian, stood out in doing the will of God, which led them, of course, to their own martyrdom, in big numbers of them, People today would like to compromise with a lot of things, their theology, their faith, just not to be persecuted. But the martyrs, St. Andrew Tygon and companions, stood up and say, you wanted to follow Christ. You want to be in harmony with His will. We want to dance with His flute and weep with His dirge. But the world that they live persecuted them and put them to death. Now they're being remembered. The great dancers who conform to the old tune of compromises were no longer remembered, but we do remember the one who dance and weep according to the tune of the divine. And I think that's very, very important, that our greatest happiness on earth is not so much of trying to stand out at the cost of this harmony with the will of God, because we become great when we are in conformity to Jesus. Look at what St. Paul said to Timothy, or rather to Timothy in the first reading today. He was talking yesterday about how the bishop, and the deacons should live. I think my favorite part is the bishop should be married only once. And the deacon should be married only once. But in any case, he said, look at Christ. Look at the example of Christ, how he lived his life. And that, of course, is the very basis of our own happiness. And so as we continue this Holy Mass today, let us be inspired by the example of Saints Andrew, Tygon, and companion martyrs. They did dance with the flute. They wept with the dirge of our Lord's passion and the mystery of his death. And that's why they are remembered today, precisely because they are in conformity to the will of God. They are in conformity with his divine plan. Praise be Jesus and Mary, now and forever.